He entered the room in handcuffs, eyes fixed on the ground, his frame skeletal and worn. The metal restraints made a hollow sound with every movement, reverberating against the polished floors like the toll of a distant bell. The coat hanging from his bony shoulders appeared to have endured decades, not seasons. Beneath it you could glimpse shredded material that once resembled a service uniform. Bleached insignias, fraying edges, the remnants of something that once held meaning. His footwear revealed the truth. One shoe had an opening so wide that his stained sock was visible, marked with grime and humiliation. The other was bound together with silver tape, cracked and curling at the edges. As he moved, you could detect the sound of damp rubber scraping against tile. Robert Patterson, 68 years old, no permanent residence, charged with creating a public disturbance. His offense: taking refuge in the lot behind Eddie's Diner during a violent storm that released 4 inches of rainfall in under 3 hours. Among abandoned carts and the stench of rancid oil blending with exhaust fumes, he simply sought to endure the night without being swept away. The courtroom atmosphere was clinical, almost unwelcoming. Overhead lights hummed incessantly, creating stark contrasts that deepened the hollows beneath his eyes. The space reeked of bleach and stale coffee. Individuals in crisp clothing looked away deliberately, rustling documents more loudly than needed. Too fragile to pose danger, too unseen to be acknowledged, too damaged to be significant. But they misjudged that final assessment. If you believe no person deserves this treatment, type respect in the comments. Your voice carries more weight than you realize. The district attorney straightened his collar with visible impatience, organizing papers as though he had more pressing matters awaiting him. The appointed counsel had not yet arrived. To those present, this represented just another file, another displaced veteran causing disruption. Nothing warranting particular concern, but Judge Rachel Montgomery was different from the others. Positioned at the chamber's front, she reviewed the documentation with eyes sharpened by experience. She turned pages without urgency until something caused her to pause. Her focus locked onto the defendant's complete name, Robert James Patterson. Her entire body tensed. A memory she had buried deep, like an old wound, suddenly emerged with devastating clarity. It was the name her child had mentioned repeatedly in messages sent from remote bases, always accompanied by the identical phrase, "Without him, I would have never returned home." Daniel Montgomery, staff sergeant, lost to an improvised explosive 3 years after his deployment ended. But before his death, he had written with the reverence of a young serviceman about a man who had rescued him in combat. A sergeant, headstrong, reserved, courageous. She studied the defendant once more, head lowered, gaze vacant, frame collapsed inward. He was both unidentifiable and unmistakable simultaneously. The years had ravaged him, yet it was undeniably him. Rachel swallowed with difficulty, attempting to maintain a neutral expression. But the hand gripping her pen shook. The institutional sterility of the chamber felt absurd confronting this discovery. The champion from her child's accounts restrained for seeking protection from a tempest. The court officer's announcement pierced her contemplation. Case number 947, the state against Robert Patterson, disturbing the peace, unlawful entry. Robert remained motionless in the defendant's seat. The fluorescent illumination cast severe shadows across his weathered features. His hands, rough and marked, lay flat before him. On his right forearm, scarcely visible through a tear in his garment, was an aged scar, irregular, profound. Rachel recognized it instantly from Daniel's descriptions. The scar across Sergeant Patterson's arm, Daniel had written, extends from his wrist upward to his elbow. Acquired it dragging me from that burning vehicle. He claims it no longer causes pain, but I observe him touching it when he believes nobody is watching. The prosecutor continued monotonously about vagrancy statutes and repeated violations. Robert showed no reaction. He sat like someone who had already surrendered to whatever judgment the world imposed upon him. The sound of rainfall still resonated faintly through the building's glass. The same deluge that had forced him to find shelter. Rachel wrote something on paper, folded it precisely, and summoned a bailiff. The instruction was explicit. Deliver this to Attorney Stephen Mitchell in person. The bailiff departed without hesitation. Before her, Robert raised his eyes for merely an instant. Their gazes met. She wanted to speak but could not. Not in this place. Not at this moment. The prosecutor's tone became more severe, more contemptuous. Your Honor, we have a habitual offender before us. Mr. Patterson has been documented numerous times for loitering, public inebriation, and now unauthorized entry. The proprietor of Eddie's Diner contacted authorities because patrons were expressing complaints. Robert recoiled at the word patrons. His fingers brushed the torn fabric unconsciously, following the scar underneath. The movement was so subtle, so instinctive that only Rachel observed it. The defendant was discovered sleeping between two refuse containers. The prosecutor proceeded, encircled by empty containers and disrupting paying customers attempting to enjoy their dining experience. The falsehood lingered in the atmosphere like smoke. There had been no containers. The police documentation mentioned none, yet Robert remained silent. He had learned long before that his testimony held no value against authority and formal attire. Several observers in the gallery murmured. Someone's device vibrated. A woman in the rear section regarded Robert with the type of revulsion reserved for objects people avoid on pathways. The overhead light sputtered, producing intermittent shadows that rendered everything uncertain. The courtroom carried the scent of industrial cleaners and aged coffee. The climate control system droned excessively loud, overwhelming the sound of Robert's quiet respiration. He sat completely still, military bearing buried beneath years of defeat, yet still present, still supporting him upright. Moreover, the prosecutor added with dramatic emphasis, vagrancy of this character generates a public health concern and reduces property worth in the adjacent vicinity. Rachel observed Robert's expression carefully. No rage, no resistance, merely acceptance. The same quiet perseverance that had once compelled him to pull injured soldiers through dangerous terrain was now maintaining his silence while strangers determined his destiny. The appointed counsel finally appeared 25 minutes delayed, carrying case soaked from the downpour. He examined the file for perhaps 40 seconds before rising. Your Honor, my client enters a plea of no contest. We request credit for time served and community service assignment. No contest, not even an attempt at defense. Robert looked down at his hands. The scar on his forearm captured the light once more. Rachel recalled another passage from Daniel's messages. Sergeant Patterson never expresses dissatisfaction about anything. Not the temperature, not the provisions, not being under fire. He simply accomplishes what requires doing and continues forward. I wish I possessed half his strength. The prosecutor smiled, detecting triumph. The state proposes 30 days county detention and a $1,000 penalty, Your Honor. It is necessary to convey a message that this conduct will not be permitted. The gallery nodded with approval. Simple calculation. One fewer homeless individual on the streets, one fewer problem to navigate around. But then the courtroom entrance burst open with a force that caused everyone to turn. Stephen Mitchell, attorney at law, announced a commanding man in a charcoal suit. His voice penetrated the chamber like a blade. I am here to represent Mr. Patterson. The prosecutor barely concealed his disdain. 11th hour representation, Your Honor. Highly unorthodox. Rachel's voice was steady as iron. I will allow it. Continue, Mr. Mitchell. Stephen Mitchell was not simply any lawyer. He was a name everyone in Dallas recognized, a figure in prominent cases that dominated news cycles. He did not typically appear in matters like this, yet he was present for a reason only Rachel comprehended. Mitchell reviewed the file rapidly, posed straightforward questions, created time, contested the prosecution. Within moments, he dismantled the prosecutor's position, employing fundamental principles of humanity and law. There exists no unlawful entry when there exists no intention to steal or destroy property. There exists desperation, survival, and societal abandonment. The prosecutor resisted discussing repeated conduct. Mitchell responded, What repeats here is not criminal behavior. It is neglect. The chamber fell quiet. Meanwhile, Rachel maintained her focus on Robert. He remained detached as though he existed elsewhere entirely. He did not appear to recognize Mitchell or even comprehend his own situation. But Mitchell was starting to perceive something. This man was not merely any displaced veteran. There was something in his bearing. Even weakened, discipline remained evident. Dignity still buried beneath years of abandonment. During a short intermission, Mitchell approached Rachel in the corridor. Now inform me who he truly is. Rachel paused, then spoke softly. The man who preserved my child's life. Mitchell stared at her for extended seconds, then nodded without another glance. Then we are not permitting this to proceed as merely another case. Back in the courtroom, Rachel reached a decision that contradicted every regulation she understood. She rose, descended from the bench, and moved toward Robert. The entire chamber went silent. Judges do not abandon their positions during proceedings. She halted 3 feet from him. Robert glanced up, bewildered. Rachel reached into her robe pocket and retrieved something small. A pair of identification tags tarnished with age. She positioned them carefully on the table before him. "These belong to Staff Sergeant Daniel Montgomery," she said quietly so only Robert could perceive. "He wanted you to possess them." Robert stared at the tags. His hand trembled as he reached toward them. When his fingers contacted the metal, his breathing altered. The courtroom observed in absolute silence as this shattered man held the tags against his chest. Rachel returned to her position. Nobody spoke. Nobody shifted. Robert closed his eyes, and for the first time in years he was not isolated. Not a whisper. And yet the chamber transformed. What transpired next was not supposed to occur in a routine disturbing the peace case. Stephen Mitchell stood and addressed the court with the gravity of someone about to alter history. "Your Honor, I petition for permission to introduce evidence concerning the authentic identity and service documentation of Robert James Patterson." He positioned a substantial folder on the table. Documents that nobody anticipated seeing in that courtroom. Department of Defense letterhead, confidential operation reports, commendation records that had been concealed in military bureaucracy for over a decade. Robert Patterson, Mitchell commenced, did not simply serve his nation. He prevented the deaths of no fewer than 7 American soldiers during an improvised explosive attack in Helmand Province, Afghanistan in 2008. The prosecutor's assured expression began to fracture. The gallery leaned closer. Mitchell read from an official military document. Sergeant Patterson maintained his position under sustained fire after securing the evacuation of 4 wounded soldiers. His voluntary choice to remain provided essential time for unit reorganization and prevented additional losses. The silence in the chamber was total. You could not detect papers moving or feet shuffling anymore. Furthermore, Mitchell continued, Sergeant Patterson was recommended for the Silver Star and Purple Heart, yet the documentation was misplaced in a bureaucratic transition. He was medically separated due to post-traumatic stress disorder and severe brain trauma, then abandoned by the system he served. Rachel's voice was resolute, yet her eyes were brimming with tears. What we have before us is not simply a case. It is a portrait of systemic failure. A man who served with distinction, who was forgotten through administrative errors, and who now, paradoxically, occupies this defendant's chair when he should be receiving recognition. She gestured toward the rear of the courtroom. 2 military officers entered. One carried a small Navy box. Inside it, a Purple Heart, an honor postponed by 14 years. Robert observed it without comprehension. It required moments for him to process what he was witnessing. When he grasped what it was, his initial response was to decline. "No," he said quietly. "I did not save Daniel. He perished because I failed." Rachel approached not as a judge but as a parent. "He survived because of you." He returned home. "He wrote to me. He described you as the most courageous man he had ever encountered, and he requested that I locate you if anything ever happened to him." Robert did not respond. He simply wept. And in that courtroom that had only perceived him as a trespasser, everyone rose. The prosecutor, the court clerk, the officers, the observers in the gallery. Nobody uttered anything. Nobody needed to. Mitchell's voice occupied the silence. "The evidence demonstrates that Robert Patterson single-handedly preserved 7 lives, including that of Staff Sergeant Daniel Montgomery, who survived for 3 additional years because of this man's valor. He pulled wounded soldiers through hostile fire, remained behind to provide protection, and bore this burden alone for 14 years. Rachel took a deep breath. "All charges are dismissed. The state will immediately commence processing all benefits and medical care owed to Sergeant Patterson under federal veterans legislation." The military officer stepped forward and attached the Purple Heart to Robert's torn coat. Robert touched the metal with trembling fingers, then looked up at Rachel. "Thank you," he whispered, "for remembering. If you believe dignity always discovers its voice even in silence, subscribe now. It is how we remember what must never be forgotten." What should have been merely administrative processing became a moment of historical restoration. Robert was summoned back to the courthouse the subsequent week, yet this time not as a defendant, as an honoree. The courtroom was not crowded like previously. There was no inquisitive audience or rushed reporters. It was a more controlled personal environment. Mitchell stood beside him along with two officers from the Dallas VA, now attired in ceremonial uniforms. And Rachel, from her position as judge, could no longer conceal what she experienced. She was not simply a judge. She was Daniel's parent. She was someone who carried the same obligation the nation owed this man. Robert entered wearing fresh clothing. A simple suit, clean, facial hair trimmed, frame still bent, yet different, not from years but from the weight of the past. A weight that was finally starting to lift. He was summoned to the center of the chamber. One of the officers read in a firm voice, "For demonstrated courage in combat, conduct involving personal danger, and direct contribution to the survival of members of the armed forces, the United States Army posthumously awards the Bronze Star to Sergeant Robert James Patterson." The Navy box was opened. The metal gleamed under the courtroom illumination, yet Robert did not move. He regarded the decoration like someone witnessing a fractured mirror. He breathed deeply and spoke with a fractured voice. "I do not deserve this," he died. The silence was immediate. Mitchell approached, positioned a hand on his shoulder. "But he survived long enough to return home, to write, to thank you, and to inform a parent that you were the reason he still possessed hope." Rachel stood, descended from the bench. "Death does not erase what was preserved, Sergeant. You provided my child time, and you provided our family more than words can convey." Robert squeezed his eyes shut. A sob escaped. He still carried guilt like someone carrying an aged weapon. "I simply did what anyone would do," he said in almost a whisper. The officer handed him the medal. Robert held it with both hands, uncertain whether to wear it or simply observe it. Finally, he closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against it. "Thank you," he said with difficulty, "for not forgetting me completely." The next gesture did not originate from Rachel or from the military officers. It came from the prosecutor. He stood, straightened his posture, and saluted. The entire chamber followed, not from protocol but from respect. Outside, rainfall had ceased. Sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting extended shadows across the floor. Robert walked out slowly, medal attached to his chest, Mitchell beside him. For the first time in 14 years, he was not walking alone. Some heroes do not display their medals, yet sometimes the medals discover them regardless. If you typed respect earlier, thank you. If you subscribed, welcome. And if this story moved you, we stand together even in silence.